Marcus Davis, a calm and composed FBI agent, sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, immersing himself in the pages of a book. The sun hung low, casting a warm glow across the lush greenery, as the distant sounds of children playing drifted through the air. For Marcus, this park was his sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the relentless pace of his high-stress job. He wasn't just reading. He was recharging, seeking solace in the simplicity of nature. Yet, even here, in what should have been a peaceful moment, his tranquility was shattered. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins walked his beat. A seasoned cop with over 2 decades of experience, Harkins prided himself on knowing every corner of the city. But when his sharp eyes landed on Marcus, sitting alone and reading in the park, something stirred inside him. There was a certain unease in the air, an instinct he couldn't shake. Something about Marcus, his calm demeanor, and the fact that he was alone, raised a red flag. "I've never seen him around here before," Harkins muttered to himself, his suspicion intensifying. Despite the vague and flimsy lead Harkins had, his gut told him something was off. Was Marcus hiding something? Was he a criminal? The officer decided to investigate. The park, once a sanctuary, became a stage for an encounter neither of them anticipated. As Harkins locked eyes with Marcus from across the park, an unspoken tension hung in the air. What would happen next? Would Marcus remain calm under the pressure, or would the situation spiral out of control? As Officer Brian Harkins walked toward Marcus, every step seemed to weigh heavier. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, studying him, searching for something, anything, that would justify the nagging suspicion twisting in his gut. The closer he got, the more he scrutinized Marcus, looking for a reason to act. But Marcus remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his gaze calm. There was no sign of nervousness, no indication of guilt. It was as if Marcus had been waiting for this moment his entire life, unafraid, unwavering, as if he knew exactly what was coming. "Afternoon," Harkins called out, his voice strained, betraying the discomfort he felt but couldn't explain. Marcus looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with an unwavering calm that immediately unsettled Harkins. His voice was even too calm for the situation, but there was nothing confrontational about it. "Afternoon," he replied, his tone almost friendly, despite the underlying tension in the air. His hands rested on the book in his lap, fingers visible, showing he meant no harm. Harkins' eyes flicked to the book in Marcus' hands. It was a simple detail, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing holding Marcus in place. His steady hands, his unflinching gaze, the way he sat without fear. "What brings you out here today?" Harkins asked, his voice a little sharper than before. He was fishing, trying to find some crack in the calm exterior, a chink in the armor. But Marcus simply smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day." The response seemed too innocent, too simple. But it shouldn't have raised any alarm. Harkins knew that. He was a cop, trained to observe and question. But there was something about Marcus that made his stomach tighten with unease. This was supposed to be a routine check, but every fiber of Harkins' instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. He felt the sharp edge of judgment rising inside him, irrational but undeniable. "From around here?" Harkins asked, his voice tighter now, the suspicion growing inside him like a dark cloud. He needed a reason, a detail, anything to make sense of the unease gnawing at him. Marcus' smile remained, but his eyes held something Harkins couldn't quite place. Something that wasn't fear, wasn't nervousness, but something more dangerous. "The truth." "I've been around," Marcus replied, his words vague but not evasive. It didn't sit well with Harkins. A slight twinge of anger sparked in him. He wanted something more concrete, something to justify his growing discomfort. "Mind if I see some ID?" Harkins asked, his hand resting on his holster, his posture rigid. The command hung in the air, a direct challenge to Marcus' calm. He couldn't put his finger on it, but Marcus' refusal to show any sign of fear was unsettling. His response was too controlled, too calm for someone in his position. Harkins' instincts, fueled by years of experience, told him that this wasn't right. Marcus' expression didn't change. He took a slow breath, his eyes meeting Harkin's without hesitation. "Am I under arrest?" His voice was measured, calm, but there was an edge to it, an unspoken warning. Harkins froze. The question wasn't what he expected. Marcus wasn't cowering, wasn't scrambling to justify himself. He was standing his ground, and that unsettled Harkins more than anything else. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Harkins snapped, his hand moving to his holster. The words were rushed, defensive. But even as he said them, something in him felt wrong, as if his own actions were out of place. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He didn't give Harkins the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger rise in him. He simply raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the threat. "I'm just sitting in a park. Is there a law against that?" His question hung in the air, a challenge, a statement of his own rights, of the quiet power that radiated from him. The tension between them thickened. Harkins could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the strange unease growing into something he couldn't ignore. He stepped closer, towering over Marcus now, trying to assert his authority, but Marcus didn't even flinch. The more he stood there, the more Harkins realized that Marcus was not just unafraid. He was completely in control of the situation. And that thought terrified Harkins. "Fit the description of someone we're looking for?" Harkins muttered. But even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. The words felt hollow as soon as they left his lips. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something else, something deeper, something he couldn't name. Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Harkins, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched long, and in that silence, Harkins realized that the real question wasn't whether Marcus was guilty. It was whether Harkins was willing to admit what was really happening. The tension between them wasn't just about authority or control. It was about something deeper, something Harkins wasn't ready to face. "What description is that?" Marcus asked quietly, breaking the silence. The words were calm, but they struck Harkins like a blow. The uncertainty that had been creeping into him came rushing to the forefront. Harkins' grip tightened on his baton. His mind raced, but his body moved without thought. "Show me some ID," he demanded again, his voice harsher, but it felt like an empty command. He wasn't asking for evidence anymore. He was grasping at control. But the control was slipping through his fingers. And the more he tried to hold on, the more he realized Marcus wasn't the one out of control. He was. The air between them was thick with tension, crackling with unspoken words and unshed frustrations. Marcus knew that this wasn't just an encounter. It was a test. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, would either de-escalate or ignite the situation. His calm demeanor was deliberate, but it wasn't born of fear. It was born of experience. He had been here before, many times, and he knew how to control the storm that Harkins was stirring. "Stand up," Harkins barked, his voice sharp and demanding. The sudden command snapped Marcus out of his thoughts. Without a word, Marcus slowly stood, keeping his hands visible and his body relaxed. He could feel the eyes of parkgoers on him, their stares heavy with curiosity and concern. But he refused to be intimidated. He had rights, and more importantly, he had the patience to see this through. Harkins moved closer, and for a brief moment, Marcus could hear the officer's breath quicken. His hands, too, were trembling just slightly. It wasn't from fear. Marcus could sense it was something deeper, something unsettling in Harkins that wasn't immediately visible to the eye. The officer was losing his control, grasping at a power that he could not claim. "Turn around," Harkins commanded, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal of the cuffs glinted in the fading sunlight as Harkins stepped forward. There was no hesitation in Marcus' movements, no challenge to the officer's authority. He simply turned around, hands at his sides, as the metal clicked into place, biting into his wrists. The tension between them was palpable, but Marcus kept his posture steady. His gaze fixed straight ahead. Inside, he felt a familiar surge of frustration rising within him, but he swallowed it down. Anger would only feed the fire Harkins was stoking. Instead, he focused on the cool, controlled breath in his chest. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to fight back. He was here to make sure this didn't escalate further. The officer had already made his mistake, and soon enough, Harkins would realize it. Harkins grabbed Marcus' arm, his grip tight and possessive. The journey to the patrol car felt like an eternity, each step a reminder of the weight of the officer's assumptions. Marcus could feel the stares from the crowd, hear their whispers behind him, but he didn't react. He knew the power of silence, of stillness. In moments like this, silence was louder than any words could ever be. As they approached the patrol car, Marcus' mind raced, not with fear, but with a quiet clarity. His identity would be confirmed. His clearance would come soon enough, but the damage had already been done. Harkins had profiled him, had made an assumption based solely on the color of his skin, and no amount of facts could change the impact of that first decision. "Get in the car," Harkins ordered, his voice strained now. The officer had already crossed a line, and Marcus knew there was no turning back from this point. His eyes never wavered as he stepped into the back seat of the patrol car, the door slamming shut behind him with an unsettling finality. The metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but it was the weight of the situation that pressed down on him. It wasn't just the physical restraints. It was the realization that despite all the work he'd done, all the accomplishments, all the barriers he'd broken, he was still seen as just another black man by too many people, including Officer Harkins. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but from a deep weariness. This was a battle he knew all too well, but the outcome was never certain. The car's engine roared to life, its vibrations humming through the back seat as they sped away from the park. Outside, the trees blurred past in a wash of color, the park fading from view. Inside, the air was thick with a quiet intensity. Harkins drove in silence, his grip on the wheel white-knuckled, his face tight with concentration. Marcus could see the officer's reflection in the rearview mirror, his face hard, the lines around his eyes etched with uncertainty. There was a flicker there, something. Was it guilt? Doubt? Marcus wasn't sure, but it was a crack in the armor, and he knew it wouldn't take long for that crack to widen. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cutting through the thick silence. He wasn't playing along anymore. He was making sure Harkins knew that he knew. The game was up. Harkins' eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his gaze briefly meeting Marcus. He didn't answer, but his grip on the wheel tightened even more, as if he were trying to maintain control over something that was slipping from his hands. "Not long now," Marcus muttered under his breath, but in truth, he knew the outcome. Harkins would soon realize his mistake, but it would come at a cost, both for the officer and for the system that allowed such judgments to take place in the first place. As the patrol car roared toward the precinct, the weight of what was happening pressed down on them both. The journey was far from over, and the true test was yet to come. As the patrol car hummed down the city streets, Marcus sat silently in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The sound of the tires against the pavement seemed to echo in the small space, the rhythm of the car's movement strangely calming in the midst of the storm brewing inside him. His mind was clear, focused. This moment was inevitable, but the injustice of it all, the weight of Harkins' assumptions, still gnawed at him, even as he refused to let it show. The silence in the car was suffocating, but it was the silence in Harkins' eyes that Marcus couldn't ignore. The officer had said nothing since they'd left the park, his jaw clenched tight, as if each breath pained him. It was clear that Harkins was wrestling with something deep inside himself. What did he see now? What did he think of this man, this suspect, who had been so calm, so unafraid? Marcus wasn't worried about himself. He knew the truth would come to light. The world was not as oblivious as Harkins might have hoped. The deeper worry was the quiet fury building inside him. This wasn't just about him being wronged. It was about the hundreds, thousands of people who didn't have the power to stand up and be heard in situations like this. How many others had felt the sting of being unfairly targeted, judged, and profiled? How many of those had not been as lucky as him to have their identity revealed, to have the situation de-escalate before it turned deadly? The patrol car screeched to a halt outside the precinct. the jarring sound of the brakes pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He could feel his heart rate quicken as the car came to a stop, the door slamming open. Harkins stepped out first, his movements stiff and mechanical. He didn't even look back as he opened the back door and grabbed Marcus' arm with more force than was necessary. The metal cuffs dug into Marcus's skin, but he barely noticed. It was the sharp sting of humiliation that hurt the most as they walked through the precinct's front doors. Marcus kept his eyes straight ahead, refusing to let his body language show how deeply the whole situation had shaken him. But it was clear, even from the way Harkins was holding him, that the officer was second-guessing every move he made. The hallway was filled with officers rushing about their business, but their eyes lingered on Marcus and Harkins. Whispers followed them as they walked, and Marcus could hear their silent judgment. Inside, the booking area was bustling with activity. Phones ringing, papers being shuffled, officers walking in and out. But amidst the noise, it felt as if everything had slowed down for Marcus. The truth was coming. He could feel it like the weight of a storm ready to break. Harkins handed over Marcus's ID to the officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. For a brief moment, there was a flicker in his eyes, a moment of recognition that didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. Jenkins hesitated, then typed something into his computer. "Captain Bennett's in her office," he said, handing the ID back to Harkins. His tone was neutral, but Marcus could see the subtle shift in his expression. They were all starting to realize something wasn't right. The doubt had started to settle in, and the wheels of regret were beginning to turn. Captain Laura Bennett was known for her no-nonsense approach. She was tough, but fair, and Marcus could already tell from the way Jenkins had spoken her name that she wasn't someone who would tolerate mistakes being swept under the rug. As they walked toward her office, the tension between Harkins and Marcus was palpable, as if they were walking into a storm that neither of them could control. Bennett's office door stood open, a faint light glowing from within. Harkins knocked lightly before stepping inside, dragging Marcus behind him like a child on the way to the principal's office. The look in Harkins' eyes had shifted. There was a mixture of uncertainty and guilt, something Marcus hadn't seen before, a crack in the armor of authority that was usually so unshakable. "Captain," Harkins said, his voice clipped, "caught this guy in the park, acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Bennett didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at Marcus. There was a long pause before her eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. It was a subtle thing, but it didn't escape Marcus. She knew exactly who he was. For the first time, Harkins seemed to lose his footing. He faltered under the weight of the situation. But Bennett's voice cut through the silence, firm and decisive. "Is that so?" she said, her gaze now fixed on Harkins. She didn't have to ask. She already knew. Marcus could feel the subtle shift in the air. The officer's error was unraveling, and the truth was coming closer. The tension that had been building for so long finally broke as Bennett turned her attention to the ID Marcus had handed over. "Marcus Davis," she said, reading the name aloud. "Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence that followed was deafening. Harkins froze, his breath catching in his throat as the weight of his mistake slammed into him. The realization was slow, but undeniable. He had arrested an FBI agent based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. Marcus met Bennett's gaze calmly, knowing that this was the moment Harkins would have to face the consequences of his actions. And as the truth settled in, Marcus felt a small sense of vindication. But the real work was just beginning. This was bigger than one officer. This was about a system that allowed such things to happen. Harkins stood there, motionless, as the reality of his mistake sunk in. He was caught, and Marcus was no longer just a suspect. He was a reminder of a truth that was too often ignored, the truth that judgment based on appearance, race, and assumption would always be flawed. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of Captain Laura Bennett's fingers on her desk. She glanced over at Marcus, who stood at attention, his face unreadable, his posture straight and composed. Her gaze softened for a moment, but she quickly turned her attention back to Harkins, who was standing rigidly in front of her, his eyes glued to the floor. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken weight of the situation. Bennett knew this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about something much deeper, and Harkins, though unaware, was about to face the consequences of what he had done. Harkins' heart pounded in his chest, his stomach a tight knot of fear and guilt. He had been a police officer for over 2 decades, a career built on following the law, protecting the community. Yet now, standing in front of his captain, he felt like an imposter. The foundation of everything he had believed in was crumbling beneath him. He had acted on instinct, but it wasn't the right instinct. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he had arrested an innocent man, an FBI agent, no less. Captain Bennett's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Harkins, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Start from the moment you saw Marcus in the park." Harkins swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but it felt impossible. "I saw him sitting alone in the park," he began, his voice unsteady. He looked out of place, too calm, too composed. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and when you've been around long enough, you develop a sixth sense. Something told me something was wrong." Bennett raised an eyebrow, her expression hardening. What exactly was wrong? He was sitting in a park, reading a book. Harkins' eyes flicked to Marcus for a brief moment, then back down to the floor. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't react like someone who had something to hide. But he wasn't doing anything wrong, was he? Bennett pressed, her tone cold, unforgiving. "No," Harkins muttered, his voice barely audible. "No, he wasn't." The words felt like lead in his mouth, each one heavier than the last. He could feel the truth, his truth, unraveling before him. The captain wasn't buying his excuse, and neither was he. Marcus stood silently, watching the exchange unfold, his face a mask of quiet resolve. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was there, in Harkins' own admission, in his growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake. Marcus knew this moment would come, but seeing it unfold was still a bitter reminder of the prejudice that had led to his arrest in the first place. Captain Bennett leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You've been a police officer for over 20 years, Harkins. You've seen countless people, countless situations. You know the difference between someone acting suspiciously and someone doing nothing wrong. Yet you chose to ignore that. Why?" Harkins' face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was just doing his job, that he was following protocol. But deep down, he knew that his actions hadn't been about protocol. They had been about something much darker. They had been about his own assumptions, his own biases, his own unwillingness to see beyond what he wanted to see. Marcus spoke up then, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Officer Harkins, you didn't see me as a person. You saw me as a threat, just because of the color of my skin. You acted on that assumption, and it nearly cost me my freedom." The words hit Harkins like a punch to the gut. He flinched, as though the truth had physically struck him. He had never intended to hurt anyone, least of all Marcus. But the truth of it, his own prejudice, his own failure to see beyond surface-level assumptions, was staring him right in the face. Captain Bennett took a deep breath, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her authority. "This isn't just about one mistake, Harkins. It's about something much larger. We cannot have officers who act based on gut feelings and biases, not when lives are on the line. You've not only violated Marcus' rights, but you've also jeopardized the integrity of the department. Do you understand that?" Harkins nodded, his head heavy, the shame weighing him down like a boulder. His mind raced with a million thoughts. Regret, fear, confusion. But there was no denying what had happened. The damage had been done, and now it was time to face the consequences. Marcus looked at Harkins for a long moment, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I don't want your career to end, Officer Harkins, but I do want you to learn from this. I want you to understand the impact of your actions, not just on me, but on every person who's been judged before they even had a chance to speak." You have an opportunity here to change. But you have to be willing to face the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. And in that silence, Harkins realized that Marcus was right. This wasn't just about the mistake he had made. It was about the bigger picture, about the systemic issues that allowed mistakes like this to happen in the first place. Bennett's voice broke the silence. This investigation is far from over, Harkins. But I want you to take some time to reflect on everything that's been said here today. We will continue this review, and you will be held accountable for your actions. But know this is your chance to learn. Don't waste it. As Harkins left the room, his mind was in turmoil. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was starting to question everything he had ever believed about his job, about justice, and about himself. The real work, the hardest work, had only just begun. The next few days moved like a blur for Officer Brian Harkins. The weight of the investigation hung over him like an ominous cloud, darkening every corner of his mind. The streets he once patrolled with confidence now felt alien to him. Every step, every glance from his colleagues, seemed to carry the weight of judgment, even if they hadn't said a word. Harkins had always prided himself on being a protector, a guardian of the law. But now, in the wake of his mistake, he felt like an imposter, a failure. His world, once solid and dependable, was crumbling. Captain Bennett's words echoed in his ears, reminding him of the gravity of his actions. You've jeopardized the integrity of the department. She hadn't minced her words. It wasn't just a minor lapse in judgment. It was a deep violation of the trust placed in him, a mistake that reached beyond Marcus Davis, beyond himself. It was a mistake that would resonate throughout the precinct and the community they swore to protect. The days following the review were filled with paperwork, formal meetings, and uncomfortable silences. Harkins had been placed on temporary leave, and the official review was underway. Every moment of the investigation was a reminder of the misstep he had made, the assumptions that had led to an innocent man being detained, an FBI agent, no less. It was the kind of mistake that didn't just cost him his career. It cost him his sense of purpose. Every time he thought about Marcus' face, calm and unwavering in the back of the patrol car, a rush of shame flooded him. How had he not seen it? How had he not recognized that his assumptions were clouding his judgment, that the fear he'd projected onto Marcus was rooted in nothing but bias? The truth was clear now, glaringly so, and it was a truth he wasn't sure he could ever undo. The day of the official decision arrived, and with it came the moment Harkins had been dreading. He stood in front of Captain Bennett and the higher-ups, his uniform tight around his chest, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to control them. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Every officer in the room was watching, waiting to see what would happen to the man who had let his prejudices cloud his duty. Bennett's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw something there, something soft but firm. A sense of responsibility, perhaps, but also the undeniable knowledge that there were no easy answers. "Officer Harkins," she began, her voice clear but carrying the weight of what she was about to say. "After reviewing all the evidence, after hearing from witnesses, and considering your own admissions, the decision has been made." Harkins' heart pounded in his chest. He already knew what was coming. The words felt like they were moving in slow motion, yet they hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. "You are being terminated from your position as a police officer." The room seemed to freeze, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Harkins could feel his entire body stiffen, the blood draining from his face as the finality of it all settled over him. He had lost everything: the job he had dedicated his life to, the respect of his colleagues, and the respect he had once held for himself. It was all gone in an instant. But even as the finality of the decision sank in, a voice in the back of his mind told him this was what he deserved. His actions had been inexcusable, his reasoning flawed, his judgment tainted by biases he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The truth had finally caught up to him, and now there was no hiding from it. Captain Bennett's voice cut through his thoughts. "This decision, Brian, is not just about your actions. It's about the message we send to this department and to the community. We cannot have officers who act based on assumptions and prejudices. You failed to uphold the values we stand for, and that failure cannot be ignored." Her words were sharp, but they weren't without compassion. He could see it in the way her eyes softened, the way her voice faltered for a moment as she spoke. This wasn't easy for her either, but the weight of what had happened, the consequences of his actions, was unavoidable. Marcus Davis's words echoed in his mind again, the steady, unwavering tone that had struck at the heart of everything Harkins had believed in. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Harkins, not to judge people based on their appearance." The words were a sharp reminder of the systemic issues at play, issues that Harkins had ignored for far too long. And now, he had no choice but to confront them head-on. "You will be placed on administrative leave for the remainder of the process," Bennett continued. "Once the review is complete, you will be notified of your final status. But for now, consider this an opportunity to reflect on what's happened and to begin understanding the impact your actions have had on those you've sworn to protect." Harkins nodded, his throat tight, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He couldn't speak. There was nothing left to say. His future was uncertain, and the regret he felt was overwhelming as he left the room. The heavy weight of the termination decision followed him like a shadow. It was the hardest truth he had ever had to face, and it would be the hardest lesson of his life. He had lost his badge, but more than that, he had lost something far deeper, the belief in his own righteousness. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Brian Harkins would have to rebuild from the ground up, facing the very biases he had allowed to guide him and learning, at long last, to see beyond the surface. The days after the termination were filled with a deafening silence in the precinct. There was no denying the fallout from the incident with Marcus Davis. Every officer, every member of the department, felt the ripple of the event. It wasn't just Brian Harkins who had been affected. His mistake had shaken the very foundation of the precinct. The trust that officers had built over years was now fragile, broken, and the entire department was forced to reckon with the consequences. Captain Laura Bennett knew that this couldn't just be a momentary reaction. It had to be a turning point not only for Harkins but for the department as a whole. She could no longer pretend that the systems in place were enough. The biases that had led to Marcus's wrongful arrest weren't just Harkins' problem. They were embedded in the culture of the force, woven into the fabric of law enforcement itself. For the change to be meaningful, for real justice to take root, it would take more than just firing a single officer. It would take a massive, systemic shift. Bennett called a department-wide meeting, and the officers gathered in the large briefing room, some with their usual demeanor of indifference, others with an air of quiet anticipation. They knew this wasn't just another routine discussion. The weight of what had happened loomed over them, and they could all feel the shift in the air. As Bennett stood before them, her sharp eyes scanning the room, she knew that they were all waiting for her to speak. But what could she say? How could she make them understand that this wasn't just about one officer's failure? It was about the culture they had all contributed to, knowingly or unknowingly. "We've all been shaken by what happened with Officer Harkins and Mr. Davis," Bennett began, her voice steady but heavy with the gravity of the moment. "But what we need to understand is this. This is not just about one mistake. This is about a system that failed. A system that allowed biases to slip through the cracks, where assumptions based on appearance and race became a part of the decision-making process." The room was quiet. Bennett could see some of the officers shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting around, perhaps unsure of where the conversation was headed. But there was no room for doubt anymore. The truth was out in the open, and it was time to face it. "We cannot ignore that we are part of a system that has allowed these biases to flourish," Bennett continued. "It's time we take a long, hard look at ourselves and ask, how do we ensure this never happens again? How do we restore the trust of the communities we serve? And how do we rebuild our own integrity?" Her words hung in the air, uncomfortable, challenging. She could feel the weight of the moment settle over her officers. But she also saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, a glimmer of realization. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand the depth of what had happened. "We will begin by implementing new training programs," Bennett said, her voice growing more resolute. We will train every officer here on racial bias, on de-escalation techniques, on empathy. And we will do it together because this is a fight we all need to be a part of. We need to understand the communities we serve and learn to see them, not as suspects, not as criminals, but as people. The words rang out with the force of truth. Bennett's eyes swept across the room, locking with the eyes of several officers who had once stood silently on the sidelines, unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to confront the uncomfortable reality of their own actions. "This will not be easy," she added, "but we have no choice. We cannot allow the mistakes of one officer to define us. We must change or we will be left behind. And when we fail not just ourselves, but the people who need us the most." For the first time in days, a sense of unease filled the room. But this time it was not the discomfort of guilt or fear. It was the discomfort of change. A change that had to happen, that could no longer be ignored as the meeting concluded. Bennett dismissed the officers, her mind already racing through the logistics of the reform plan. She knew that there would be pushback, there always was, but this time she was prepared. For too long, law enforcement had been allowed to operate within its own bubble, separate from the very communities it was meant to serve. Now they had to face the truth. Marcus Davis had been the catalyst for this change. His quiet strength, his unwavering resolve, had exposed the cracks in the system that no one else had been willing to see. And though his ordeal had been painful, more painful than he ever should have had to endure, it had ignited a fire within the department. A fire that would burn away the old ways of thinking, replacing them with a new vision for justice, equality, and understanding. Bennett didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that the process of healing, of real reform, had to start now. And it would take every officer, every person in the department, to help rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It was a long road ahead, but it was the only road that mattered. The day was cold, the sharp wind cutting through the streets as Marcus Davis walked toward the precinct. His steps were deliberate, measured, but there was something different about today. The tension in the air was palpable, heavier than the usual sense of duty that he carried. Today, he wasn't just here to ensure that justice was served. He was here to see if the system could actually change, to see if the very people who had wronged him were willing to face the truth. As he stepped into the building, the hum of activity in the precinct was different. Officers moved about with a quieter air, their usual hustle tempered by something unspoken. Maybe it was the weight of the past few days, maybe it was the ripple of discomfort from the aftermath of the review, but Marcus could sense it, the shift. The department had been shaken, but had it been enough to stir real change? He didn't know, but he hoped this meeting would tell him everything he needed to hear. He made his way down the hall, his boots clicking on the tile, each step bringing him closer to Captain Laura Bennett's office. She was a woman of few words, but the ones she did speak carried weight. He respected her for that. She had been the one to stand up and face the uncomfortable truth, the one to take responsibility when no one else would. But even with all that, Marcus wasn't sure what to expect. After all, the change she spoke of wasn't something that could be fixed with just words. He needed to see action, real action. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, before knocking softly. "Come in," came Bennett's firm voice from inside. Marcus opened the door and stepped in, closing it gently behind him. Bennett was sitting at her desk, papers scattered before her, but her eyes lifted when he entered. She stood up immediately, offering him a brief, sincere smile. There was no pretense, no empty politeness, just an acknowledgement of the weight both of them were carrying. "Mr. Davis," Bennett said, her voice steady. "Please sit." Marcus nodded and took the seat across from her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with an unspoken understanding. This was the moment of reckoning, the moment where they would decide what the future would look like, not just for him, but for everyone affected by the culture of systemic bias within the police force. Bennett didn't waste any time. "I wanted to check in with you. I know this has been an overwhelming few days, and I want to make sure we're moving in the right direction." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Captain, I'm glad to hear that you're committed to change. But I need to know something. Are you just saying the right things? Or are you ready to make the changes necessary? Because it's easy to talk about it, but actions speak louder. Bennett's face softened for a moment, the weariness in her eyes betraying the gravity of what they were facing. You're right. It's not enough to simply say we're going to do better. The actions need to match the words. That's why we're starting new training, focusing on racial bias, empathy, and de-escalation. But I know that won't be enough if we don't confront the deeper issues, the mindset that allows biases to thrive. Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. And how do you plan to ensure that everyone, from the top down, is held accountable? It can't just be one officer. It has to be a shift in the culture of the whole department. Bennett paused, her eyes searching his face for a moment. That's the hard part. It's not just about training. It's about creating a space where officers feel they can speak up, where they're not afraid of the system that protects them but doesn't protect the communities they serve. I'm pushing for more transparency, more oversight, but I'm also pushing for those hard conversations to happen within the department. Marcus' jaw tightened, the weight of what he was hearing sinking in. This was important. It was necessary. But he also knew that words and plans meant nothing without the will to follow through. I've heard it all before, he said quietly. I've heard people talk about change, but then nothing happens. The system protects its own, and people like me end up paying the price. Bennett's eyes hardened slightly, her resolve clear. This isn't about making promises. This is about creating a real foundation for change. And I know I can't do this alone. I need people like you, Marcus. People who've seen the system from the outside. People who know what it feels like to be judged before they've even had a chance to speak. Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. And I'm willing to help. I'm not doing this for me anymore. I'm doing this because I want to see real change. Because no one should ever have to go through what I went through. But the truth is, this isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time. And it's going to take the willingness of every officer to truly look at themselves and see what they've been complicit in. Bennett nodded, her expression serious. I know, but I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure this isn't just a moment of talk. It has to be a movement, and we'll need your voice to help lead it. The weight of the conversation settled in, but Marcus felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something bigger than either of them could have imagined. As the meeting ended, Marcus stood up, his hand extended toward Bennett. She took it firmly, a gesture of solidarity, of commitment, of shared responsibility. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus believed that change was possible. It wasn't just the beginning of a conversation, it was the beginning of a revolution. And he was ready to fight for it. As we draw the final lines of the story, it's important to reflect not just on the events that unfolded, but on the powerful lessons that can be learned from them. The journey of Marcus Davis, Officer Brian Harkins, and Captain Laura Bennett was one marked by conflict, growth, and the ultimate quest for justice. But in the end, it wasn't just about one man's mistake or the systemic flaws that were exposed. It was about the potential for change and the responsibility we all share in making that change happen. Marcus, despite facing wrongful arrest and the heavy weight of injustice, stood firm in his resolve. His strength was not only in his ability to endure, but in his willingness to speak out, to stand up for what was right, and to demand accountability from those in power. His actions remind us that the fight for justice is not always easy, but it is always necessary. His commitment to transforming the system, rather than just seeking personal vindication, is an example of true leadership. Marcus didn't just want to clear his name, he wanted to clear the path for others, ensuring that no one else would face the same wrongful treatment. Officer Harkins, on the other hand, represents the journey of self-awareness, humility, and growth. His story is a sobering reminder that none of us are immune to biases, especially those we may not even realize we carry. But more importantly, Harkins shows us that it's never too late to learn, to confront our mistakes, and to change. The willingness to face uncomfortable truths is the first step toward real transformation. It's not enough to simply recognize the issue. We must take action, whether it's through education, introspection, or actively working toward making things right. And then there's Captain Bennett, her courage, determination, and commitment to reform. She didn't shy away from the difficult conversations. She didn't ignore the uncomfortable truths. Instead, she took action, setting the stage for systemic change within her department. Captain Bennett's leadership shows us that change starts from the top down. She made it clear that transformation isn't just a personal responsibility. It's a collective one. By creating an environment where officers can speak up and hold each other accountable, she started a movement within the precinct that could ripple outward, affecting the entire law enforcement system. That I end this story, we see the power of accountability, the importance of empathy, and the necessity of leadership that is both self-aware and committed to improvement. It teaches us that while systemic issues are complex and entrenched, they are not insurmountable. Change requires intention, courage, and collaboration. We must look inward, acknowledge our faults, and work relentlessly to correct them. Not just for ourselves, but for those we serve as we look toward the future. Let's take these lessons to heart. Change is possible, but it begins with us. It begins with the choices we make in our everyday lives, the way we treat others, and the way we hold ourselves accountable. It begins with the willingness to listen, to learn, and to do better. If you found value in the story of Marcus, Officer Harkins, and Captain Bennett, take a moment to reflect on the role you can play in your own community. Whether it's standing up for justice, challenging your own biases, or encouraging positive change where you see it. And remember, real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when individuals like Marcus, like Bennett, and even like Harkins choose to take that first difficult step towards something better. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons shared, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we explore not just the struggles people face, but the victories they achieve through resilience, growth, and change. By subscribing, you'll continue to be part of this journey, where together we can learn, grow, and make a lasting difference. Thank you for being part of this story, and remember, change starts with you.